April 3rd, 2020. This was the day that Resident Evil 3's highly anticipated remake hit the shelves, and RE fans across the globe were booting up this remake for the first time and playing through the story of Jill Valentine during the events of the Raccoon City outbreak. Coming off the back of the highly received Resident Evil 2 remake, many had very high expectations for this installment, and while the core game and its gameplay were appreciated, reviews would flood in shortly and the reception was not as good as Capcom were hoping. As to why this was the case, let's dive back into the original and why that was so great to many players, and see how its success affected the reception of the remake's execution, and overall just discuss the criticisms that the remake had. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was the title of the third installment of the original Resident Evil trilogy. Following the release of Resident Evil 2 and set at roughly the same time, this entry released in 1999 and followed the story of Jill Valentine, a member of the STARS unit in the police force. The premise of the game shows Jill being caught up in the citywide T-virus outbreak and attempting to escape the city while being chased by a relentless BOW created by Umbrella called Nemesis, on a mission to eliminate all remaining STARS members. The game would see the player navigating Jill through the city, solving puzzles and uncovering the truth behind the outbreak. This would be the first entry where action seemed to be brought way more to the forefront in comparison to the rest of the entries that came before, with the player having access to a dodge ability, making encounters even less tense while adding additional depth to the gameplay. This, however, did not take away from the tense atmosphere and unnerving tension, which of course Nemesis definitely had a lot to do, especially with how they executed Nemesis's encounters in the original game. The remake for Resident Evil 3 unfortunately was not met with the same level of positivity as its prior remake entry, that of course being Resident Evil 2 Remake that came out in 2019. As for why this was the case, there are a multitude of reasons. Firstly, the game's overall story was much shorter. Locations and bosses were removed or modified to the point they were practically no longer in the game to the same significant degree. Mechanics like choosing to fight or escape Nemesis were no longer in the game, along with the sense of urgency. Many would go on to comparing the 3 remake to a DLC, as it seemed to rip a lot of assets away from the Resident Evil 2 remake, which, while expected given they were developed very closely together and using the same engine, there was just not enough content for it to warrant a full retail cost game. So many would disregard this and classify it as a glorified DLC to the Resident Evil 2 remake. Areas such as the cemetery, factory and clock tower were cut from the game as well, dealing a massive blow to the game's overall reception. The linear nature of the remake seemed to be quite the downfall for the game, and while many, including myself, could appreciate what Capcom let out as a standalone game, or even an expansion to Resident Evil 2 depending on how you see it. Of course it wasn't an expansion, but some do hate it enough to view it as that. I think it was quite a letdown in comparison to the original. However, while the original was well received overall, it did get criticism for the length of the game and increased action in comparison to the prior entries that came before, so I feel like this is something that is not generally touched upon when dissecting the remake's execution and response, so definitely should be mentioned here when putting that as a criticism for the remake, as both were given the criticism of being too short for their time that they released in. So the question remains, was it a bad game? Of course the answer to that is very subjective, but you're here because you're interested on my take on it, or you're just bored, maybe both, but regardless, I think it wasn't as bad as many made it out to be. At face value, Resident Evil 3's remake offered excellent visuals, recreated locations and characters in stunning modern day graphics, and offered a fresh take on the same overall story. While some things were changed, I think if it were to not be compared to the original, it was quite a solid installment in the series outside of the game's runtime. I think a lot of what people criticise the game for stems from its connection to the original, which I think is a fair and understandable comparison given it is a remake, but I think to really enjoy the title you have to try and lose that mental connection with the original and take the game for what it is, which is simply a story running parallel to Leon and Claire's Resident Evil 2 campaigns. And of course it is a continuation of Jill Valentine's story following the events of the Spencer Mansion. Gunplay is one of the key areas that I think they did very well on. It is what you would expect from a modern third-person Resident Evil game, with fun weapons to play with and overall good core mechanics. The lack of decision making, like the originals, makes the game much easier to follow, as well as it does give a clear canonical view of the game's story instead of players speculating what actually happened or using future content as a hint as to what the actual outcome was of those choices that you were given in the prior entries. And then on top of that, I think the biggest thing that the remakes were able to do is make the timeline more canonically connected to the rest of the stories told throughout the franchise, and also help retcon fix up any areas that aged poorly given how long ago the original released. I think there were a few things that were underutilized, and this is not comparing it to the original, this is just in general as the game stands alone. I think there were a few things that were either underutilized or just not accessed to the full potential. The first of which being Nemesis and his encounters. I think the issue here is that Nemesis was only a stalker role for an extremely short period of time and quickly becomes quite an easy and predictable threat. After that, he becomes a glorified boss that transforms over the course of the game, making for different quote-unquote boss encounters of virtually the same boss. This was not helped by the lack of city exploration either, and very linear and reduced overall city locations, which I think definitely could have been utilised much better, and this would have allowed for Nemesis to be more of a stalker role throughout the story, as of course there would be more to explore and actually force the player to traverse through. And I think this is one of the glaring issues in the remake when you play through it, especially when you play through it the second time and you're more familiar with how the story plays out in the remake's version. It just becomes very glaring to the player. In addition to this, puzzles were very lackluster, with only a few to solve and not much thought needed to actually solve the few that did exist. And overall, the replayability, with all these other factors added up, did suffer a lot from this linear nature of this entry, along with, of course, as I mentioned before, its short runtime. While there are all these negatives, I think they did do a good job, however, in modernising the story of the third mainline Resident Evil game, but it simply did not utilise its full potential anywhere near as well as the other remakes of the series. And of course Resident Evil 2 would be the key example of this, as it did come before, and Resident Evil 4 is the clear example of how Capcom is able to learn from their mistakes. So if anything, Resident Evil 3 was a good sign that Capcom is able to take on feedback from the entries that are performed poorly, or at least performed poorly in comparison to the others, and capitalise on said feedback in the most effective way possible. I definitely think that many do bash this game much harder than it actually deserves, and a lot of this does stem from its connection to the original, like I said, and the fact that I did follow on from such a highly received remake such as 2019's Resident Evil 2. I think players do need to be a bit more open, or at least the players that do bash the game need to be a bit more open to looking at the game from a different perspective. But as always, let me know down below what you guys think of this game and whether or not you enjoyed this at launch, along with how you feel about the game now, and I look forward to reading all of your comments. As always guys, a like would be extremely appreciated if you did enjoy the video. It does help out the channel a ton, and subscribe for a lot more Resident Evil content. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye.